very much, everybody. I'd now like to hand you over to Professor Mitra. Thank you.
I'm going to use this mic because even though I live in Newcastle, I can't talk loudly.
No idea what that means.
if you go to Newcastle on a Friday evening, you'll realize it's supposed to be the noisiest and the loudest city in the United Kingdom. Anyway, so the idea for this day is actually based on a short meeting that I had with Joe about a year ago, wasn't it? When I was visiting some schools here. And that's the story that I'm going to tell you anyway. Now here, we are obviously all concerned with university education, whereas almost all of my work has to do with children. Having said that, there are aspects of the work done with children which you'll notice immediately applies to almost any other form of education. And also, I would imagine that many of you here have children. So I think you'll be able to apply some of what I'm saying to both your life, personal lives, as well as to your working life, I hope. So the way the day is structured is that there are two talks, which I have optimistically targeted to finish by 10:30, but it's not going to happen. So we'll see how it goes. I might just do the first one and give you a little break to think about things, and then do the second one. After which, we have some workshops. The reason for these workshops are that what I want to discuss in that are things that I don't know, actually. So I couldn't tell you about them. The idea is, by the end of the day, if we're lucky, we get these ideas come out from the room. And I'll explain as we go along how we intend to do that. So on to the first bit, which is called the End of Knowing. It's actually based on about 20 years of work. We're getting on to 21 now. Work with children and learning. And as you might imagine, that during those 20 years, from the late 1990s up to now, the world itself was also changing. So it's kind of strange, because normally when you do an experiment in science or in social science or whatever it is that you are studying doesn't change as you experiment. So particularly in the natural sciences, if you're studying a pendulum, well, the pendulum still moves the way it used to move in Galileo's time. So you can study it for as long as you like and figure out how it works. But when it comes to learning at this point in time, when you study learning, the subject itself is changing. And you'll see some flavors of that as we go along. But let's go back to 1999 for a moment. In 1999, I used to work in New Delhi. And by the way, I don't have a formal background in education. My formal background is in theoretical physics. And that's what I did in university. And at the time when I did my PhD, physicists and mathematicians were the only people who knew how to write computer programs. So what happened to a whole bunch of PhDs around that time, the late 70s, was that all of us got dragged off by the industry into computers because we knew how to work them. So in 1999, I used to work in New Delhi teaching people how to develop software systems. They were young people and they were quite rich, or at least their parents were, because these courses were very expensive. And it was a very posh office, etc. But right next to my office, as is fairly common in the developing world, was a large, sprawling urban slum. And it had lots of children in it. So, when I used to walk into office, the thought did cross my mind about those children. Not because of social equity or anything like that. It was simply that, how many good software developers am I missing in that lot? It seemed like a waste, because there were these hundreds of children milling about, and I said maybe some of them would make terrific programmers. But why don't they have the opportunity? It's because you can't build a school where they are, inside the slum. It's not safe, it's not hygienic, etc. And you can't get teachers to go there, again, for the same reasons. So as a result, the slum gets left over there, and the children who can afford it get to learn stuff from these PhDs about writing programs. So that lot, the slum children, are going to grow up back in the 90s not knowing what a computer was. Because remember, at that time, everybody didn't have computers. So, the personal computer was just about coming in, and there were many people who didn't know about computers, and almost nobody, no average person knew anything much about the internet. So I thought, well, so my students are going to come out of this university knowing everything about computers and the internet. That lot is going to grow up knowing nothing about it. So clearly, there's going to be a problem. The question is, so how could I teach them about computers and the internet so that, so as to level the playing field? You can't set up a school. Now, around that time, something else was happening. Something rather interesting was happening, and there may even be a few people in this room who've seen that. We were buying personal computers, people who had money, and they were expensive. They were a couple of months' salary. So you bought a personal computer, it was huge, big monitor and so on, with a floppy drive, and you paid whatever, 5,000, 6,000 pounds for it, got it home to do, well, word processing and things like that. Some people did email using a modem. Does anyone remember the sound the modem used to make when you connected it to the telephone line? It was a famous sound. Anyway, at that point, some of my friends and myself, we had all bought computers. And I started noticing something rather interesting. Well, firstly, my computer, it arrived in a large cardboard box at home, and my son was 7 years old. I started to open the box in my study, take out the computer, and I see this little head poking out at the back. And I still remember turning around and saying to him, "Don't even think about it. This is a very expensive piece of equipment, and etc." But anyway, it never works that way. All of us, my friends and I, had children, and the children wanted to see what's going on. And then something interesting started to happen. Many people would say to me, "My little girl, I think she's special. think she's an advanced learner. So I said, why do you think that? Oh, you know, the other day I was working on my computer and I got stuck with something, and then I hear her from the back say, no, what you have to do is to, click on this and then do stop and then restart, and then everything will be fine. So, I think she's an advanced learner. This wasn't only one story. Many of my friends were saying the similar story. And the same thing was happening at home. I would be looking for a file, and the files would flash by. In those days we didn't have colored monitors. There were green letters on a black screen. And if you said directory, D-I-R, a list of files would just flash by. And I would say, oh, let me see which file I found. When I heard this little voice from the back, it said, if you do dir/w/p, then it will come page by page. And I said, how do you know that? And he said, well, you did that last week, you've forgotten. So then I realized that all these children were watching us. They weren't allowed to touch the computers. So then I went back to my club or wherever I met my friends and said, listen, I think we should let them go. We should let them have a go at the computer. Oh, if they break it, I said, they won't break it. There's nothing to break in a computer anyway. And we let them. This was happening around the time when I was thinking about the children in Islam. So I said, all right, we can't give them a school. We can't send teachers there. But I can give them a computer. So everybody said, and? So I said, and nothing. We'll give them a computer. Or they'll break it, or they'll steal it and sell the parts. I said, yeah, I want to see that. The next problem was, where in a slum would I put a computer? You can't put it on a table in the street. Leave alone a slum, you can't do it here on the main road. If you put a laptop on a table in the main road, it will be gone in, 20 minutes or something. So I borrowed an idea from the banks and made a do-it-yourself ATM in the wall that separated my office from the slum. So I made a hole, put a glass pane, pushed the monitor against the glass pane, so the computer is on my side of the wall, bricked up. And on the other side you can see a screen and a touchpad. And I put Windows on it, whatever version of Windows existed at that time, and I put in an internet connection. I had no idea what else to put. Should I put some special software, whatever? I had no idea, so I didn't put anything at all. And I turned it on. It was 3 feet off the ground, and as you might imagine, immediately got surrounded by children. So there I was. This is a picture from the first few minutes actually. They just stared at the computer, and they didn't come near, and they didn't touch it. And they would look back at me. So at that point, I think, I moved from physics to education, because I understood something very important about education. That children don't do anything if there's a guy wearing a tie standing behind them, looking at them. So this thought just came to my mind that they're not doing anything with the computer, not because of the computer, because of me. So I turned around and walked off, and as soon as I did that, I heard the voices of children behind me. About 8 hours later, one of my friends came in and said, gosh, how did you teach them so quickly? So I said, teach them what? Well, what are they doing? I said, they're surfing, looking at websites. I said, oh, who showed them? So he says, that's what I'm asking you. I I said, well, I didn't show them anything. And in any case, in what language are they looking at all this stuff? And he said, well, that's my next question. It looks like English. So I said, but they're not supposed to know much English. Well, he said, well, that's my question too. Anyway, the morning of the second day, the newspapers landed up. And there was this tongue-in-cheek article in the Times of India saying that there is this guy who claims that children in a slum can teach themselves to use the internet by themselves. And he claims nobody taught them. The way the article was written made it very clear that they thought I had actually quietly shown them something, but I hadn't. At that point, I was left with no choice but to defend my honor by repeating the experiment. The favorite theory at that point about this experiment, which the press called the hole in the wall, was that there must have been a passing student, one of my students possibly, who showed them how to use the mouse or the touchpad. And that's how it all began. Sounded like a good theory. So I repeated the experiment. I got a bit of funding. I repeated the experiment about 300 miles away from Delhi into a really remote little village. The kind of place where the chances of a passing software developer would be zero. Okay. So I said, well, nobody can show anything here. So I did exactly the same thing, put the computer in there. The children came around, stood there quietly. I turned around, I went away. A week later, the same results. When I went back to the village again, they were playing a game. Now, I hadn't put any game on the computer. So I said, well, what's that? And the children said, oh, nothing. So I said, no, where did you get it from? Oh, we didn't do anything. I said, no, I'm not saying you did anything. I'm very proud of you. I just want to know where you got that from. And they looked at each other, and I said, was it from the computer? They said, no. So I said, then? They said, from there. I said, there? From where? They said, there. And I couldn't quite figure out, but I could sense that they were trying to describe the internet. And just think about it for a moment. If I were to ask you a really silly question, like, does the internet exist? Well, obviously everybody is going to say yes. Let's say I ask you another question after that, which is, where is it? Do you realize that you have no choice but to go back to my village children's answer and say it's there? What does that mean? Networks don't have physical reality. They exist, but they don't. So, anyway, these were the first steps in the hole in the wall. At that point, after the second experiment, many people started contacting me, saying that this seems to be a good way for children to learn how to use a computer. It doesn't involve schools and it doesn't involve teachers. But the big question is, who is teaching them? And I had no clue, I had no idea how to do educational research, and so I followed this as my main method. If you look at that picture on the top right-hand corner, it's myself about 20 years ago. I used to just keep peering down at the computer from there, trying to figure out who or what was teaching them. And I couldn't figure out a thing, because they were just talking, muttering to each other, shouting, fighting, and every now and then something new would happen on the screen. So, at that point, the World Bank heard of this experiment, and they funded me. They said, look, you have to do this experiment properly with controlled samples, do a study to show what is it they're learning and how quickly. don't know how this is happening, but we do know that it is happening. It needs to be measured. So I got an opportunity and I repeated the experiment in 23 different places all over India, choosing the places by socio-economic conditions, by geographical factors and all sorts of things, and carried out this study. So what you'll see is a typical glimpse from one of these places. Remember, these are 20-year-old videos taken with 20-year-old cameras. So basically, they would be milling around the place like insects or flies. And every now and then somebody would get their hand on the mouse. But things would happen. The study showed that the study showed something really interesting. It's published actually, you can see it on the internet. It said that groups of unsupervised children given access to the internet in a safe and public place, these are all the important factors, safe and public space, would in a period of 9 months reach the same levels of computing literacy as the average office secretary in the West. It was an absurd conclusion, but it was based on numbers. At that point, people said, so what's going to happen to teaching? I didn't know the answer. I said, I'm not talking about teaching, mathematics or medicine. I'm talking about teaching computers. It's obvious you don't need to teach it. After several more experiments, here was the first of the conclusions. Children can learn to use the internet by themselves. But please keep in mind the last 3 lines. They're very important, and I'm going to repeat them over and over again because they're extremely important to learning today. We must have unsupervised heterogeneous groups accessing the internet through large visible screens in a safe and public space. All of those conditions are important. And to those of you who, I'm sure, have a fear about children and the internet, you realize that the fears that we have about children and the internet are because we don't follow what's written on those bottom 3 lines. If you have a group of children, if you have a big screen in a public space, you don't have to be scared. So we learned this, I published the results, and at that point in time, Newcastle University got a pretty big research grant to improve the quality of schooling in underprivileged areas, particularly in India. So they called me and they said, you should be doing this. So I was quite happy. I said, yeah, sure, I mean, that's a lot of money. Here I am, I'm sitting in the middle of New Delhi, I'll do it for you. And they said, no, that's not how we spend university money. We'll give you a position, you have to come to Newcastle and do it. So in 2006, I moved from New Delhi to Newcastle. I had no clue where Newcastle was. So my friends told me, buy a big overcoat. I did that and moved to Newcastle. In Newcastle, I was sitting over there in the university doing my work in the developing countries, basically studying this hole-in-the-wall kind of process. When a local school teacher popped up in my office. She wrote an email and then she came and she said, what are you doing? What about our schools? So I said, what about your schools? I mean, your schools are fine. Your schools you have plenty of computers, you have good teachers, you have everything that you should have. I don't think my work applies to your schools. And she said, come with me to Gateshead. And she took me to Gateshead and then to County Durham. And she showed me some of the poorer areas of the Northeast. And I realized that there were many problems that were identical. So she said, her name is Emma. So Emma said, let's do the hole in the wall experiment in England. I said, absolutely not. I'm not going to do it. So she said, why not? I said, because you can't, you know. You can't do the hole in the wall experiment in England because all you get are frozen children. You can't do anything outdoors in England. so she said, no, come on, be serious, you'll have to apply the principle. So I did. What I did in England was to turn the hole in the wall experiment inside out. How do you do that? Very simple. You can actually do it with older students here at the university as well. In a classroom, put in 4 or 5 computers. Let's say if there are 20 children, put in 5 computers. 1 to every 4. And then ask the children, put the computer such that standing anywhere in the room, you can see all the screens, the 5 screens. Remember, public visibility. And then ask the children a question. Can you figure out, and ask them a question, an interesting, nice question. Let's see. Okay. Let's say you're talking about 9-year-olds. So, in Gateshead, in one of the schools, I asked the children, what would happen if you didn't cut your nails? And so, they'll grow big. So I said, yeah, and how big would they grow? I said, oh, they'll grow pretty big. So I said, will they grow so big as they'll go out of the door? And then they laughed and said, no, not that big. So I said, oh, that's very funny. They'll grow big, but they won't grow beyond a certain size, you're saying. Do you know? And they said, no, do you know? I said, no, I don't know either. But can you figure it out? And as you might imagine, at that point, so Emma said, coming from her schooling background, she said, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask them to make groups, and then shall we suggest some websites? I said, Emma, we'll do nothing of the sort. We're doing the hole in the wall. There is nobody there. So you and I, we will sit down. So we sat down in the corner of the room, and as you might imagine, chaos started. The children running about everywhere, shouting this, that, the other thing, and about 40 minutes later, the answers started to come. And as we heard the answers, we became very quiet, because the answers were about evolution, anthropology, flight and fright, coming from the mouths of these 9-year-olds of Gateshead. And Emma said, so what's going on here? And she asked the same question that people had been asking me in India. Who taught them? And I said, no, I don't know. Nobody did. So we gave it a name, this method. We called it a self-organized learning environment, or a SOE. Wasn't possible to do this before the internet, but it is possible now. What do they look like? They look very chaotic, very noisy, but with stunning answers to big questions. Here, take a look at this.
Three-dimensional, so that was achieved by the front being lighter than the back of the pin. So I chose three-dimensional.
Let's just look at this question one more time and read what it says.
Well, I'll just describe to you what Emma, that's Emma. What she's doing there is, she's given this question to 8-year-olds. The question is, how do the climactic conditions they have in Australia affect the way Australians live? Imagine that for a question to 8-year-olds. And this is them figuring it out. They talk about the deserts in the center, therefore the coastal settlements, etc.
Maiores estudiosos modernos, segundo tribes, os sonhos.
At that time, word of mouth was going from staff room to staff room in Northeast England, and there were school teachers experimenting with this in their classrooms. This was back in 2006. I started to get invitations from all kinds of conferences to describe the process. And to my surprise, it started spreading everywhere. It spread into southern Australia, the state of Victoria. It spread into throughout Latin America. That last girl over here is from Chile. And then it started spreading into Europe and finally into the United States. What is the essence of the method? The essence of the method is that whatever these children have to learn is eventually the answer to some big question. So, instead of the regular teaching and learning process, what if we present that big question first? What happens? And these experiments, all of which are again published, said something rather devastating. I mean, I've been a teacher all my life, so it is hard for me to write that sentence that you'll see just now. Children in souls can learn anything by themselves. And you'll notice my 3 lines at the bottom appear again. Unsupervised, heterogeneous groups, public visibility, and safety. Anything? Well, how do you prove that they can learn anything? Well, I did a series of experiments, making questions harder and harder and harder. We had Tamil-speaking 12-year-olds in India describing the mechanism of DNA replication at the university level in 3 months' time. Back in England, we had 8-year-olds answering GCSE A-level questions in groups using the internet. And I said to Emma, okay, let's hold on for 3 months and then give them the same questions and tell them this time you can't use the internet, you can't talk to anybody, just do it on paper and pencil. And noticed that they had photographic recall of what they'd done 3 months ago. So we said, well, this is too good to be true. They not only learned the stuff, they also remembered it. So the method started spreading everywhere. I noticed at that time that there was a way to amplify this effect. As a teacher, obviously in this method you raise the question, you don't teach. But at least with children and possibly with any kind of learner, what you can do is to admire them. It helps. Simply to take a walk and say, wow, I didn't know that. You know, children love to hear this. I didn't know that. And the child will go back home and talk to the parents who later described to me. They'll say, you know, there was this question, Professor Mitra from Newcastle University, he didn't know the answer, we told him. So I said, okay, so here is a motivator that's really easy to use. I wrote an article in the Guardian newspaper saying, if you like children, if you're interested in children, if you have a broadband connection and a web camera, can you give me 1 hour of your time every week for free? And I got hundreds and hundreds of volunteers. They formed a loosely structured group, still exists today. They're called the Granny Club. Why Granny? Because I gave this method a name, this method of admiring the children. I gave it a name, I called it the method of the grandmother. You know, just the archetypal grandmother. They don't have to be old, they don't have to be female, but what I mean by the grandmother's method is, if you think about it, the parent and the teacher generally uses discipline as the method to make children learn. You must practice more, you really haven't done your work, etc. The granny doesn't. What the granny says is, my goodness, how did you do that? Can you do some more? So she uses admiration instead of discipline to drive the learning spiral. The granny cloud could be beamed using Skype to places where good teachers cannot go. And what would they do there? Well, I told them, don't teach. That's the last thing you want to do is teach over Skype. I mean, teaching regularly is boring enough. Over Skype would be terrible. So just talk to them, read them stories, do whatever. Just have a chat, have a conversation. We started experimenting with this from my office in Newcastle, and here's an example of the very first few days. So I noticed that the accents of the children who were, 5,000 miles away from where this woman is sitting, the accents of the children would change not in days and hours, but in minutes. Because, they had no other model to follow. So I said, well, this is for free, and this is happening. So a combination of the self-organized learning environment and the granny cloud would produce a new kind of learning. So you basically need the presence of an admiring and encouraging adult. And that seemed to help so. Then in 2013, I won a prize. It's called the TED Prize. And it's a lot of money, it's $1 million prize. So I gave that to the university and I said, I need to do a set of experiments where we bring in self-organized learning environment and the granny cloud together into a single educational device or place, and we will call this the school in the cloud. So a school in the cloud is not a website, it's a physical space where you have self-organized learning and you have the granny effect in some way or the other. I built 7 of them. 5 in India, starting with the remotest place that I could find in India, in the Sundarbans Delta. That's where the Ganges meets the Bay of Bengal. It's really wild. It's Royal Bengal tiger country. So I built one there. There's no healthcare, there's no electricity, there's nothing there. It's a glass structure, public visibility, remember? It has 6 big screens inside. It has internet from a mobile tower, and it's powered by solar energy. And that's it. I can't get teachers there anyway, so there's no question of teachers. But there is a supervisor to open and close the place. So I built 7 such facilities, some not so remote, 5 in India and 2 in northeastern England. The ones in England were inside schools, and similarly of the 5 in India, 2 were inside schools. Here's a look at what they look like. This is one in Bengal, this one in Western India in a school. This is in the Punjab. Up in northern India. This is an exotic Killingworth, it's a suburb of Newcastle. This is Harlem in New York. And finally I got the whole model together into one in a village in Bengal again called Daskara. So for about £5,000 you can build this in the compound of any school anywhere, ground upwards, with everything, with the glass walls, the computers, the internet connections and everything. And then what happens inside? Well, that's the hard part, because if you ask a government, they'll say, well, what's the structure, what's the curriculum, what happens inside? Well, nothing happens inside. In the morning you open it and in the evening you close it. The children figure out what they would like to do. Sometimes a teacher would throw in a question. Now remember, all this took almost 20 years to do. And in those 20 years, something else happened. Again, not a very interesting, not a very nice sentence to show to 140 teachers. In 20 years, the internet made traditional teaching into the least efficient and the most expensive way to learn anything. Well, go on and throw eggs at me if you like. But that's how the young people today view learning. So, we have undergraduates in Newcastle University who ask this question. Why are we paying £10,000 a year to do stuff that we could have Googled? We need to all answer that question. And every time we walk into a class, we need to ask ourselves, can what I'm going to do next for the next 1 hour, can it be Googled? If the answer is yes, maybe you shouldn't take that class. So what did we learn? We learned 3 things. Firstly, that there's a generation of children growing up who can handle a device by themselves. That's the bottom left side, the graph on the bottom left side. That's the hole in the wall graph, straight up like that, on computing literacy. In those days it was called computing literacy, now it's device literacy. And I think all of us know that. We know that 3-year-olds can handle an iPad. No one needs to teach them. The graph in the center says that if you allow heterogeneous groups to access the internet to search for answers to big questions, their internet searching skills go straight up. They begin to learn how to discern between right and wrong, good sites, bad sites, fake news, real news, etc. And on the top right-hand corner is possibly the most interesting result as far as governments are concerned. There is a rapid and remarkable increase in reading comprehension. The internet doesn't know that they're children, so the internet throws everything it has at them. The children don't know what they're supposed to be able to read and what they should not be reading, so they read everything. So you get 9-year-olds quoting from the Harvard Business Review. Should they? Well, I don't know, but they seem to be able to make sense of it. So basically, schools in the cloud will improve reading comprehension, produce accurate searching skills, produce learning with good retention, and obviously it improves communication and collaboration skills, because that's what they're doing all the time. And something that I didn't expect is the last line. If you practice it, it changes you, the teacher, in a very strange, different kind of way. It makes you somehow softer, less aggressive. You realize that you don't have to know everything. And that there is a power in a teacher standing in front of an audience and saying, I have a question, but I don't know the answer. So what's the teacher's job in this world where your students are sort of enmeshed inside the internet all the time? Well, we could tell them to put their devices away, which is what we end up doing. Don't bring your phones here, don't turn them on, etc., etc. I wonder how much of that is because of our genuine love for learning, and how much is because we are a little afraid of what they might do with that device. So suppose we were to be not afraid, what should we do? Well, my suggestion from these 20 years is, this is what I do with children. I tell them, you go there, I'll go with you. What else can you say when you have no clue where the internet might take them? So basically, a soul is a chaotic environment from where you get spontaneous order. We'll talk about this in a moment, but before that, let's go to the bad news. Assessment. Assessment systems are completely out of date right now. You know, you sit alone, I'll give you a piece of paper and pencil, I'm going to ask you a question, you have to be able to answer it. Why? Why? Give me my phone back. No way. Okay. Where did that assessment system come from? It came from a couple of hundred years ago, actually. It came from a time when all administrative systems were manual, paper-based. You had to know how to read, you had to know how to write well by hand, because everything was written by hand, and you had to know how to do arithmetic in your head. You had to. That's the clerk of the early 20th century or the late 19th century. We had a world which needed millions of them, all the way, everywhere. So, the people of that time, particularly the Victorians, created a machine to produce these identical people. And that machine was called a school. So that realization came to me as I watched the hole in the wall. And I said, okay, here's this brilliantly constructed machine existing at a time when its utility is gone. So we need assessment systems that are suitable for our times. You need to be able to give your students a computer and say, well, here's a question. Figure it out. Tell me how quickly can you give me the answer. Why? Because that's the kind of environment they're all going to land up in their offices. When they join their new job and they have a problem to solve, nobody's going to expect them to sit alone with a piece of paper and pencil and solve that problem. They'll be expected to work in groups. They'll be expected to use the internet. So assessment needs to change, according to me, from just in case to just in time. What do I mean by that? If you look at a lot of education as it's done today, particularly school education, if you had to answer the question, why am I teaching this? The answer would be, just in case it's ever needed. So everyone in this room, for example, has been taught at some stage how to solve a quadratic equation. You can see some expressions of horror. Anyway, we were all taught how to solve a quadratic equation. Why? Well, just in case. Just in case when you step out after this meeting outside, if you were to encounter a ferocious quadratic equation, you should know how to solve it. So, I don't think most people have ever solved a quadratic equation after they solved the last one in the last exam, which was trying to figure out if they knew how to solve it. So, how do you solve a quadratic equation if you ever encounter one in the unlikely eventuality? Well, you know the answer. You pull out your phone and you say, hey, Google, and he'll solve it for you. You need to know how to ask that question, and you need to know how to detect if the answer is right. You don't need that formula. So we need to change learning from just in case to just in time. And I think if we did that, you will find immediately an increase in student engagement. So why is this happening the way it is? Well, this rather dramatic title for this lecture is because of the shift from just in case to just in time. I call it the end of knowing. And actually it's a term that a very famous person in MIT, I'd spent a year at MIT Media Lab as a visiting professor and, with Nicholas Negroponte. He listened to a similar talk by me at MIT and said, you know what you're talking about is, you're saying knowing is obsolete. And that sounds so terrible, because you know, we pride ourselves on knowing things. But when that little rectangle of plastic in your pocket knows everything, how important is knowing? So here's what I'm suggesting to schools, and much of it I think will apply to universities. We need to introduce the internet as a subject to every student, no matter what their disciplines are, because every subject is affected by it. What do I mean by internet as a subject? Well, I will start with something like, I would say, how many people in this room use WhatsApp? And you know, everybody might raise their hands. So then I would say, well, what happens when you type a message in WhatsApp into your phone? How does it get to the other phone? And almost nobody would raise their hands. Or they would guess, oh, there's a server somewhere. And they say, well, what's a server? Oh, you know a server, it serves, or something like that. We don't know. We use the internet 24/7. We have no idea how it works. We have no idea who finances it. We have no idea if anybody controls it. And of course, like the children of my Indian village, we don't know where it is. It's there. That situation needs to be changed. It's like physics or chemistry or geography. The internet is a subject. There is this associated subject from my old subject physics, which needs to be taught as well, particularly in the sciences. It's called complex dynamical systems. What happens when things get connected to things? It's a very important subject now because we have 4 billion human beings connected to each other. What one does affects all the others, and what they do affects you. That's a complex dynamical system. I'll show you an example in a minute. We need to divide the curriculum up into 3 bits. The first piece, things that you need to live. So if you're training your students to in hydraulics, you obviously need to teach them not the history of hydraulics, but how to do things with hydraulics. So the first part is what you actually will use. The second part is an interesting part. Are things that you should know because they're nice to know. There the end of knowing doesn't apply. It is nice to know that there are planets out there. You can go through life without knowing anything about them and still live perfectly normally. But you should know. You should know about Mars and Jupiter and so on, because it's nice to know. And then there's the third bit, which we need to take out. The stuff that we ask in exams, which are taught simply because they might be asked in an exam. If we made that change to curriculum, we would get better attendance and better engagement. And finally, well, I've been saying this for 3 or 4 years now, completely unsuccessfully, allow the use of the internet during exams. To do what? Well, some people tried, Denmark tried. They called me there about 5 years ago. About 3 years ago, they said, we've done it. We've introduced the thing. A friend of mine from Denmark wrote, they've actually allowed the internet. 6 months later, he wrote, alas. They've stopped it. I said, why? He said, we gave them the internet so that they can look up stuff. They can look up websites and things. They're not doing that. They're WhatsApping their friends around the world asking for answers to questions. So I said, well, is there something wrong with that? And in the words of a gate-set little girl with whom I'd done, in their class I'd made this experiment, okay, you can use the internet. Oh, that's cheating. I said, no, it's not cheating. It's called sharing. Go ahead, use the internet. Do what you want. And one little girl said, can I really do what I want? I said, yes, what is it you want to do? And she said, can I call my mom? And I thought, well, if you have a problem, and if you have a phone, and if you have a mom, why not? So, let's not go back to that situation where they say, but everybody doesn't have access to the telephone, you see. But everybody does. So, bring that into education. So that's the end of the first bit, the future of learning. What I think we'll do is, why don't we do a few questions and then take a short break before I go into the next one. Is that okay? Okay. And before you get to the questions, while you're thinking of the questions, I want to show you something. Okay, it's really silly, little experiment. It takes only a few seconds to do, which is, can you clap synchronously? You know what I mean? Okay, can you do it, please? Okay, 3 seconds. If you record that and play it back in slow speed, you'll notice the first second is chaotic, and then it collapses into order. How does it work? Do you know that this clapping problem has been around for 300 years with mathematicians? It's still not been solved. We don't know how it works. We know this much, that when you clap, other people can hear you clapping, and when they clap, you can hear them clapping. So clearly, your claps change depending on what you hear, and your clapping changes what they hear. It's a complex dynamical system. Nature uses it all the time. This idea of order out of chaos. It costs no money. All I'm saying is that in a teaching learning environment, if you knew how to trigger it, your job's done. By something. Not yourself, but it's done. We'll talk about that in the next bit. But for the moment, if you allow all this to sort of go down in your mind, what kind of a question? Do you have a question or a comment or a suggestion? Anything at all?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Given the fact that people who control the education system are terrified of change, they're emotionally attached to the system that's been going for 200 years, how long would you predict before what you're suggesting would come into fruition?
Okay, it's a good question. It's I wouldn't quite say that they're terrified or that they're stuck in the past. It's not quite that. I'm in close touch with several governments, including ours here in London. They have watched and read about this work in detail. All the bureaucrats know about it. Their problem is, if I change the exam, who's going to bell the cat, so to speak? The first people to object would be the parents. We're scared of the parents because the parents in a democracy, they're voters. You mess with children's education, you could risk your seat. So people everywhere, you notice this if you watch, before an election, the usual agenda is, I will transform education. And after the election, not a word anymore about it. So this is one of the things that's always pulled back progress in educational systems. But the answer to your second question, how long will it take? I used to feel very disappointed that, this is just going to go on and on and on forever. But I'm not. I'm actually very optimistic. I'll tell you why. About 3 years ago, there was a newspaper article in India. In India, the equivalent of the GCSE exam is an exam called the CBSE exam. 300 million children take it. There was an article in the newspaper saying, Army deployed to search for mobile phones for 300 million children. Okay, how else do you search for, so they put the Indian Army to do this. So I'm watching this, laughing to myself. A year passes, and a similar article again, which says, schools concerned about the use of smart watches and Bluetooth earbuds. So now they're going to search you for the mobile phone, they're going to say, show me your watch, and then they're going to look inside your ears to see if you have a Bluetooth earbud. In the meanwhile, in the MIT Media Lab, there's an invention. It's called a sub-vocalization microphone. It sticks here. It's almost invisible. You know, when you're driving or when you're by yourself, we talk inside our heads. Well, when you do that, the sound box actually does vibrate exactly as though you were speaking, except that it does it with a very low amplitude. The sub-vocalization mic can pick that up. So it's called thinking aloud. What it does is that you can think of a question, just say it in your mind. It takes the question and puts it into Google. And then it takes the answer, converts it into sound, and feeds it back into your ear through a tiny Bluetooth microphone. Okay? There's a YouTube video showing a university student wearing one of these things, and a professor who is sort of sitting across the table and saying, okay, tell me something about the capital of Denmark. And the student sort of looks down like this. Let me see. Copenhagen was created in the year. He starts like that, and then the professor, of course, questions him after, and it ends with a frightening statement, because the professor says, so what does it feel like? And the student says, it feels strange, but it feels nice, because I know everything. So, why am I hopeful? One day, very soon, maybe within the next 5 years, primary school teachers will face a classroom full of 8-year-olds who know everything. And apart from doing surgery on them or putting them through an MRI scanner, you wouldn't know how they know. When that happens, and when it happens to your undergraduates, what are you doing? What are you going to do when a student says, I just checked, what you said is wrong? So that day, the system collapses, particularly the exam system. It's not far. So we have two options. One, for an institution like this, you beat the system before it beats you. Allow the internet in right away. Ask the questions that are right for that environment. Don't ask questions that you can Google and find the answer in 2 minutes. Or hang on to the old system until it collapses. I sound rather dramatic, but believe me, it will.
Ironically, in this very room last month, we were running exams saying, if you're wearing a watch, take your watch off, put it on the desk.
Yeah, there you go. So, yeah, so that's it. As opposed to saying, use your watch. Imagine a question in civil engineering or something like that. It says, design the foundation of a bridge which spans across a blah, blah, blah. And at the end says, use your smartwatch to figure it out. Then, the kind of question you'll ask would be those to which the internet doesn't have an obvious answer. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next bit. What do I mean by the big questions? Why are 9-year-olds so interested in the big questions? Because they are questions to which there isn't a right answer. There are questions to which maybe answers are not even known. If you ask a question to which no one knows the answer, the internet doesn't either, because the internet is us. I find it intrinsically a lot better to walk into a classroom full of undergraduates or postgraduates and say, I'm going to tell you, well, let's say I'm teaching physics, and say, I'm going to tell you the biggest things in physics that we don't know yet. What if that was the first lesson in your first day of undergraduate? And then say, you're going to spend the next 3 years paying your £10,000 to figure out what the answers to this might be, because none of us profs know it. I think it would make the university a lot more exciting. Well, sorry, long answer to a short question.
So, how do you envision an education system for the future in terms of the structures of schools, if they exist, and assessment systems and all of that? So we've had a look at what we're doing now, and I think you've put forward a very persuasive case that that's perhaps a little bit out of date. So how do you envision what it might look like in the future?
Well, actually, that's what we're going to do in the rest of this day.
Right.
Honestly, I'll tell you where I've made some progress and where I've not. I've made some progress with curriculum. That what should the future of curriculum be? I've made a considerable amount of progress, as you might have heard, in pedagogy. What is that method? And I'm suggesting actually a fairly simple change from the lecture to this self-organized learning environment. Where I've not succeeded is in figuring out what the new assessment system should be. Easy enough to criticize the old one, but again, the answer to your question, why hasn't it changed? Where is the alternative? It is for professors like me to provide that alternative. We've not been able to so far. So we will I want to go back from the Isle of Man with that answer. Okay.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know what group dynamics were going on with the hole in the wall experiment. So did you find there was natural leaders, hopping out to taking the lead with the children, that sort of thing?
Well, the original hole in the wall was, as you might imagine, white. I mean, there was just nobody there. So what happened there is rather interesting. The bullies would move in, the little bullies, because, it was a question of who grabs the mouse. There was no mouse, but a touchpad. But something interesting happens. When the bullies get to the touchpad, they don't know what to do. Okay? Who knows what to do? There's usually some tiny little fellow who's really clever. So what happens is after a while, the bullies turn to this, so what were you doing before we came? And they pull that little fellow in. In many of the hole-in-the-wall experiments in India, the girls were key to the whole thing, the little girls. They invented administration and management. That one is for boys, this one is for girls. That little fellow, he can't even see the screen. You lift him up and show him the screen. Okay, they figure out all of this by themselves. They prevent quarrels and fights and things. So that was the hole in the wall. In souls, what happens is equally interesting. There is one operator. Somehow the group elects an operator. Okay, you handle the computer, because remember it's one computer to 4 or 5 children. So they figure out who's going to operate. So one child is operating. Next to him is another child who's his advisor. Okay, you tried that. No, we already tried that. That didn't work. Oh, that's an ad. Forget that ad. Let's go somewhere else. Sorry, the advisor does that. There's a third person, a third child, who is the note taker. She or he has a piece of paper, is jotting down stuff, because in the end they have to present whatever they found. And there's a fourth character, very interesting, who hovers around these other 3, constantly disturbing all of them, and everyone else in the room, throwing stuff, doing all kinds of things, and every now and then these 3 would, oh, shut up, they would say. I have a feeling, I don't know from where it comes, but I have a gut feel that fourth character is very important. And I got a clue from the experiment I did in Gateshead, where 3 months later everybody had good recall. But I asked one of the girls, how on earth do you remember that complicated answer? It was a question about electromagnetism in GCSE A-level question, and she's 9. How on earth do you remember all of this? And she said, do you remember Peter? And I said, yeah, Peter wasn't doing very much. But he was poking me with a pencil, that's why I remember everything. Who knows, you know, this brain up here, it's a very strange thing. I don't know what forms those associations, and maybe that joker at the back is what holds everything together. Maybe that's why Shakespeare's plays have a joker in all of them, or whatever. So this is the structure of the group of 4. And in the wild, it's not as though it degrades into vicious fights. I've never seen one like that. Mainly because it's heterogeneous, the girls move in, and the girls would say things like, if you're going to fight, nobody gets a turn. And that sort of stuff, right? And this self-ordering, and a sneaky suspicion that it's the same mechanism as by which your claps came together. I don't know how that works.
So would assessment be that you'd have, one of your big questions, you'd have your self-organised learning environment, you'd allow them so much time to work on it, and then they'd all split up and individually create their responses, write their responses, and be assessed on their individual response, which would arise out of the soul.
You know, what I do is, firstly, the groups are fluid. In a properly done soul, you're allowed to change your group and move to another group if you're not getting along well or you don't agree with the point of view, so you can move. You can look at other people's work and then come back to your own group and say, they've got a better website, we are on the wrong track, and you're allowed to do that, self-correction. So you cannot examine a group because the group itself is fluid. So what I do is, I say that if there are 5 computers, I say, at the end we will have 5 presentations, 1 for each computer, regardless of who was around it. And you guys decide who is going to present. Usually about 4 or 5 children would come up with pieces of paper and they would read, and then I would say, okay, this is what they said. I summarize what they say. I never add anything, I just summarize. I say, these guys said the following. Who goes next? So another lot comes up. And I distill from there whatever they're saying, and usually try to join it to the first group. So I say, they've added something to what the first group said. It's a bit of an art doing that correctly. You should never say, the second group said exactly what the first group said. Okay, that doesn't work. It dampens the spirit. So if you do that, and then you build up a body of knowledge at the end, and then I summarize it. So in short, this is what you found. And then I would say, guess what? This stuff is taught in universities with grown-ups, and everybody sort of goes up. So that's the nature of how the souls are.
You speak here about groups. If we go on the other side of the parents, let's say I talk as a parent rather than a teacher. My child at home has a laptop. Do you think the same learning happens if they are on their own with the laptop?
No. No. I shouldn't say a blanket, no, but by and large, no. They do look for things, but one child with one computer can go astray. You know what I mean? That they'll Google something. If it's a group, if it's this heterogeneous, fluid groups moving around, somebody will say that the third one down the list, that's the one that we should be looking at. There's no one to tell that to the single child. So the single child struggles. And in the process of struggling, he or she realizes that maybe what they're looking at is not quite right. And it goes into a negative spiral. Oh, this is very boring, she says, and closes it. One way out, all these dangers that we talk about with the internet, how come we never had those with television? It's because the TV screen became bigger and bigger, as opposed to the internet screen, which is becoming smaller and smaller. Because the TV became big, and because the TV sits in the living room, we were never worried about the TV. At best, you say, stop watching TV, you've been watching it for 3 hours now, whatever. But you can see what your child is doing with the TV. If next to that TV was an equally big screen with the internet on it, that would be the safest way. Then you can draw your child into your world. You could say, I've got a piece of fish, but I don't have any garlic. What do you think I should do with it? Now your child will figure it out. Okay? Or the mom, come here, here's this thing which is saying this is how you can do it. Do you think we can? Whatever. We need to make the internet public and collaborative. And as far as homes are concerned, well, you know, our lifestyles are so different now. I mean, we don't visit each other or so on. Otherwise, I would have said, how about a weekend, Sunday morning, you know, cake and biscuit party with all the children and ask them a big question and say, you sort this out and watch what happens. If we could do that sort of thing, it would be extremely healthy. But just to end, I can't help tell you one story though. I live in Gateshead, in an area called Felling, which is a rather poorer part of Gateshead. I went to live there because the kind of children I work with, they live around that area. It's full of council houses and old coal miners' houses. Quite pretty actually. So anyway, next door to me there was a little girl called Casey. And Casey and her friends were very curious about my wife and I. You know, who's this Indian guy? He's a professor, why does he live here? So they used to come, they used to talk to us and so on. And I never spoke about what I did. I used to talk about all sorts of other things. I was making a pond, so they were very interested in the pond and so on. One day, Casey appeared with an iPad. And I said, goodness, Casey, so your dad got you an iPad? And she said, yes, he got me an iPad. And he said, I'm giving this to you under one condition. You will use it only with 3 other friends of yours. I realized that Davy, my neighbor, had been Googling me. And the story has a nice ending. Casey just finished her GCSE A-level, and she wants to work in a jail. I said, Casey, what for? She's now 16 or something. I want to figure out why jails exist and why people get into them in the first place. And I thought, gosh, if that's what a soul can do, that's good enough for me.
Good question, Pete.
Yes, please.
You talked a lot about souls and getting the knowledge from the internet. A lot of what we do here is we're training people to be chefs and teachers and electricians. Are you saying that the skills part of it can come from that as well, by YouTube or other methods?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I used to have a PhD student who worked on this in FE colleges in England. I've done several experiments with her. You get some interesting results if you allow the students to figure stuff out. One experiment that I did was with a group of, you know, they're 17, 18-year-olds. They were learning scaffolding, how to build a 2-story, 2 floors scaffolding. So I sort of talked to the teachers, like I'm doing here, and I said, let's do this experiment. You take your class and break them up into 2 groups. To one group, you teach it the way you teach it. To the other group, you ask them to figure it out on their own. And there was consternation, you know, with the 17-year-olds. Are we really allowed to use YouTube? I said, yeah, go ahead, use whatever you want. Well, to cut the long story short, what happened was, the first group learned exactly what they were supposed to learn. And the next step was to build a scaffold. The second group, the YouTube group, had by that time built a 2-story scaffold, stood on top of it, got themselves photographed by each other and put it up on Facebook. Okay. I asked the teacher, have they done it right? And he said, well, not quite. They have made several pretty serious mistakes, but they're standing there, you know, and it's not fallen yet. So I said, what would you do next? So he said, should I tell them what the mistakes are? I said, no, just tell them there are 3 mistakes in it, and you figure it out. And they'll figure it out too. So anyway, that's the long and short of it is that yes, you can. So you can reverse the process. You can simply say, say you're teaching, this is a real experiment again, you're teaching hairdressing. So you give the dummy, you give them all the hairdressing tools, give them a tablet, give them YouTube and say cut, produce a cut. When I did this one I did in Calcutta in India, and I again asked the teacher and she said, well, I would have done that in second year. Because you know, YouTube will have the most recent, the latest stuff. And I said, well, I mean, is there any rule that you have to do this in first year and do that in second year? She said, not quite, but that's how we do it. So I would say try it. Well, it's 11. Shall we take how long do you think about this? 30 minutes?
Well, aim for 20.
Okay, 20 minutes.
And then if there's a queue,
Yeah, no, by the time we come back.
a few minutes over.
So what we're going to do is a 20-minute break, then you come back in, and I'm going to talk about something called the future of work.
Can you just listen, please?
And so after 20 minutes, I'm going to talk again, I'm sorry, about the future of work. And I promise you after that I won't talk. After that we'll figure out some stuff. As you might imagine, that if we have to figure out the answers to some questions that I don't know the answer to, you know how we do it. There's only one way I know. So we'll try that. That's what the workshop is about. Okay, see you in 20 minutes. So what I'm going to talk about, as you can see, is called the future of work, and again, a much less charted territory for me than what I spoke about earlier. Earlier I was speaking about things that I'd actually done and measured, and so I could tell you that I did this and I saw that. I can't say that about this topic. I can only make some guesses. So let's see how it goes. So firstly, I guess our major worry at this point in time, worry or otherwise, our major anticipation has to do with automation. And you might think that, has this not been around earlier? Well, I don't think it has been around earlier to the extent that it exists now. Earlier, it used to be more to do with machines. Now, it's actually a little beyond the machine. Let's see how that goes. So firstly, let's look at why is it that we worry about automation as opposed to welcome it or look for it. If we look historically at the role of automation or the role that it has played in human development, well, I mean, I guess the story starts with machines instead of muscle as the very essence of Homo sapiens. You know that story, the opposable thumb, the ability to use something to amplify muscle. That led into something rather different, a social issue. On the right side, this familiar looking device, the earth mover. On the left side are these women who do the same work. The left-hand picture is from India. For some reason, in the middle of a 45-degree scorching summer, the people who do earth-moving work are invariably women. Okay, and I've sort of never understood why they're all women all the time. Although the women have often tried to explain it to me. The explanation, as you might guess, is that the men are busy, they're drinking. So somebody has to do it. So anyway, they earn money, they used to earn money like that. It's awful. So what happened? The earth movers came in. But left behind a whole lot of very disgruntled women who said, you know, who told you to bring this great big monstrous machine which does the work of 40 of us? There were 40 women earning money. Okay, it was hot, that's all right, we didn't complain about it, did we? So it brought in a different kind of issue. Was it good or was it bad? And I don't know the answer really. I suppose, oh. This is why you shouldn't have phones, right? There must be something I can do to it. Silent. So, was it good or bad? We don't know, and this is endlessly debated, this whole idea of automation putting people out of work. And on the other hand, automation making life easier and more comfortable. So there was a lot of routine work, and we created machines that would make it easier to do this routine work. Another contentious issue over there, on the left-hand side, paper and pencil. On the right-hand side, the typewriter. Paper and pencil was considered an art that needs to be taught to children. They should learn scripted handwriting. Why? So that somebody's handwriting from New Zealand should be legible to someone in Canada. Why was that important? The administrative machine. Data used to be captured on pieces of paper written by hand, transmitted by ships, and it actually went from New Zealand to Canada. It was very important that the data should be meaningful and readable by the time it arrived. Good handwriting. The typewriter changed all that because now everything's standard. If your ribbon is all right, it's all readable by anybody. So, makes sense to change machines to do routine work. But having said that, there is this debate going on all over the world right now. Children are not writing by hand anymore. There are children who can't even hold a pencil properly. Well, my take on it is, so what? Give it another couple of years and there will be children who will look at a pencil and say, what's that? So what? I mean, they already say that about CDs. I've met children who look at a CD and say, what's this? I've met a little girl, one of my favorite stories is a little girl in Bombay, walking down the street with her mother, who was a friend of mine. She was, I think, 3 years old. And she pointed to a post box and said, what's that? And I said, you know, it's for sending letters. And she looked up and down, she was tiny, she looked up and down. Said, they put a scanner inside. She said, so she couldn't conceive of the fact that a person came and took out the letters and took it somewhere. So, machines to do routine work, good or bad, we don't know. Machines to collect data, that seems to be a fairly non-controversial use of machines. So we have telescopes and microscopes and everything. Or is it? Well, if you look at modern experimental physics, there is a body of people who would say there is excessive reliance on mechanically collected data. We tend to believe the data collected from machines intrinsically and never question it. What if the machine is not measuring what it's supposed to measure? So contentious issue again, but then machines to collect data are everywhere. Then perhaps a much less contentious issue, or at least a much more universally accepted use of automation. We like this sort of thing, don't we? We've done it for 100,000 years now, created machines to destroy and kill. And we've made some remarkable progress to the right-hand side picture, which is kind of an absurd end to creating machines to kill, because it leaves no one else left to kill. So, it's anybody's guess whether we should head in that direction either. Then there are machines that copy repetitive actions. So on the left is I think, a loom. On the right is the printing press. So instead of having to, go stamp, 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 which people used to do, you have the machine doing the repetitive work. Everybody agreed that it's fine, it saves money, this is progress. Except for, of course, the guy who used to do the stamping, who lost his job or whatever. But then the answer is that we're going to retrain him to become the operator of the press. Works to some extent, but not entirely. All this began to change somewhere in the 1970s, the late 1970s. It started with Jacquard's loom, which could be programmed to produce patterns. And then, of course, it went to the digital computer and machines that pretend to think. And why do we say pretend to think? Because it uses what you see on the screen. It uses a flow chart of some sort. It goes in and yes and no answers, and depending on whether the answer is yes, you do this, and no, you do that. And if you build a machine which follows a flow chart, it often enough looks as though it's thinking. And people will often say, oh my goodness, how clever that machine is. It's actually pretending to think, or we think it pretends to think, because we don't know if our brains work that way or not. Then we started to look at the brain itself and discovered that it actually is a very simple machine in design terms. It's just interconnected neurons. What's a neuron? Well, it's a cell that can either turn itself on or off. And it's depending on if it turns itself on, its neighboring neuron can get turned on or off. So you could have different kinds of, so you can build a network with them. And we have, I think, about, I don't know, close to 10 billion, I forget the number of them together up inside our brains. It's one of the largest networks in nature. I didn't know that the number of synaptic interconnections inside a human brain are larger than the total number of subatomic particles in the known universe. It's a huge, gigantic network actually, packed into a very small little space. But the thing is, what does it do? Well, all that it does is that one neuron affects the others, and all the other neurons react, and their reaction changes the neuron which started it all in the first place. It's constantly clapping. And occasionally those claps come together. We understand a little bit about that now. So, back in the 1980s, physicists and computer science people said, okay, we don't understand thinking, but we know a machine which does thinking. It's called the brain. So why don't we simulate neurons inside a computer? And if we have enough of them, then presumably the computer will start thinking. The trouble is that even the supercomputers of the 1980s could not simulate 10 billion artificial neurons. It could simulate a few thousand, And when those few thousand were built, almost instantly insect-like behavior started to emerge from the system. So it was intriguing. I grew up in physics in those 80s and 90s, and it was an intriguing possibility. Why don't we have a machine to do this properly? And then, boom, late 1990s, early 2000s, by 2010, we had computers that could simulate a large enough neural network, as they're called. They're called ANN, Artificial Neural Network. What can it do? Well, you show it a face, some of the neurons fire, everything goes into chaos. There are no patterns, nothing, except that 6 months later, when you show it the same face, the network says, I've seen that before. Where is it kept? We don't know. There's no photograph kept inside anywhere. We don't know anything more than the fact that we've connected it the way it's connected up here, more or less. But now we have no choice but to say that the artificial neural network thinks and can learn. Why do we have no choice? Because it's no different from what we have inside. So if the brain can do it, this can do it. If the two are almost identical, one is biological, the other is not, that's all. So, neural networks are dependent on fast processors, and the processor speeds went up fast enough so that the phones that you have in your pocket are now capable of working with human being-sized neural networks and producing results. The next thing we know about the brain is that it depends on multi-sensory inputs, the 5 senses. Well, that's no problem at all. Those sensors have been around for a long time, and they all came into the phones. The cameras, the microphones, speakers for output, etc. Then came this whole hype about big data. What is big data? Well, big data is that if you have a large enough data set, then you could get patterns inside it which would not have been obvious with a smaller data set. Why did we not do this before? Because we couldn't. We didn't have the means to process large data. But now we do. It is possible for a processor the size of the one which is inside your phone, which is about the size of your thumbnail, can analyze 1 trillion Facebook pages and start showing you patterns, stuff that you didn't know about humanity. And finally, you have trainable algorithms, meaning if you don't know how to do something, by repeatedly showing a machine someone doing that, the machine itself learns how to do that by itself. It's somewhat like the YouTube question, that by watching enough YouTube videos you learn to do something that you didn't know before. Our brains are capable of doing that, and increasingly our phones are capable of doing that. We are that close, or maybe not even that close, we are there already, to where you don't actually know what your phone is doing, even when it's off. Does anyone control it? The surprising answer is no. There are people who create those algorithms, but having created them, have no clue about what's going to happen next. It reminds me of a rather famous quotation from Stephen Hawking, disliked by many people, who said, at the end of one of his books, he said, the story of a creator watching helplessly as his creation unfolds. People don't like the word helplessly, but that's more or less what's happening to our processes. So, machines that are better than us. We weren't worried about the earth-moving equipment. We said, yeah, of course it's stronger than us, it's got more steel and it's got an engine and how we created it. But as soon as you get to machines that can think better than us, we seem to have a problem. Oh, that's dangerous, they'll take over, etc. If you watch TV, you'll hear this all over the place. But here's some numbers. More than 50% of all the work in data collection, data processing, repetitive muscle blah can be done now entirely by non-humans, by machines. Over 50%. So that number is going to grow, in any case, to 100 quite quickly. To show you an example, to help us think about the social issues connected with this, this is 19th century. This is an invention from the 19th century, Calcutta. The hand-drawn rickshaw. And they're still around, by the way, in Calcutta. You can get a ride in one. They're quite expensive though. But the fellow, as you can see, doesn't wear shoes. And you would think, oh, how terrible, how poor he is. Except that they have a rickshaw pullers union, which is extremely powerful. And if you ask the guy why he doesn't wear shoes, he says, because it makes my work easier. A lot of people don't understand this, but apparently it's easier to pull a rickshaw without your shoes on than it is with your shoes on. So it's not as though he's, doesn't have enough money to buy shoes. He just doesn't need them. Anyway, the rickshaw was invented in the 19th century, continued on, and can do certain things which you normally cannot do with machines. For example, there's a large open drain in Calcutta, still existing, and if you want to go to the other side, there's a long detour. So it's several pounds worth of a taxi ride to go right across. You can't take a hand-pulled rickshaw because it's not very deep. And he'll take you across for less money. You save many minutes and many pounds by using his hand-pulled rickshaw. It's another matter that he's wading through that mud barefoot, but that's a different story. Anyway, what happened to these guys? 20th century Calcutta, well, a simple invention, the cycle rickshaw. So that seems to be a nice thing to do. The cycle rickshaw gets you to places quicker. You don't feel as bad sitting in it as you used to earlier. You still feel bad because the poor fellow's pedaling, but not as bad as him pulling you along. The cycle, the hand-pulled rickshaw union came out in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, violently against the cycle rickshaws, saying they're taking away our profession. They should be banned off the roads. They should be, because this is automation taking away our jobs. So people said, what do you mean? I mean, what's so unfair about it? It's just because I can't afford to buy a cycle rickshaw, my hand-pulled rickshaw remains unused. So it became an economic issue, a political issue, etc. Automation. Then, a little change. 21st century Calcutta still looks like the cycle rickshaw, except have you noticed that this guy doesn't have his feet on the pedals anymore? He's got them up. Okay, it's got a battery. Okay, so he doesn't need to pedal. The union went against after the electric rickshaws. It's taking away all our jobs just because I can't afford to buy the batteries, etc., etc., etc. nothing could stop the spread of the electric rickshaw. Everybody loved it. Why? You don't feel the qualms of conscience anymore. Your rickshaw puller is not pulling anything, he's got his feet up, he's having a chat with you, and he's driving his electric rickshaw. It's also considerably quicker than the cycle rickshaw. Then the owners of the electric rickshaw started to put windshields, a cover, all the things that he didn't put earlier because it would have made it more difficult to pull or pedal. But now he doesn't need to pull or pedal, the battery is doing all the work, so he's putting in all this stuff. It started to evolve, even its name changed. By the way, if you go to Calcutta, they're now called Totos, an electric Toto. Okay, of course, they're more expensive than the cycle rickshaw, which is more expensive than the hand-pulled rickshaw. The Totos were developed in many different countries. This is the shape they take now. This is Prague, the Czech Republic. It's more expensive than a taxi. But there it is. It's a very nice looking thing. And then, last year, on a visit to Delhi, the Indian Institute of Technology, I saw a Toto with a difference. Doesn't have a driver. You just get into it and say where you want to go. It just goes there. So they're going to hit the roads anytime. I mean, we've all been following this whole idea of the driverless vehicle. It's an interesting story because the West is stuck with what happens if it causes an accident. That's because we are going towards the car and the truck and the highway. In the streets of Calcutta and Delhi, the really crowded streets, the algorithms may be more difficult, but it's almost impossible to have a fatal accident. Because this electric Toto just stops when it's in doubt. So I think that they're going to actually enter from the bottom of the ladder, not the top. And now the unions don't know what to say. Earlier, the hand-pulled rickshaw union used to complain about the cycle rickshaw guys. Then the cycle rickshaw guys union used to complain about the electric Toto drivers. Now, who do we complain against? The union versus the algorithm. That's a hard one. Okay, pretty hard to spell actually. So at this point in time, machines that are almost better than us affects almost 5% of all occupations. You know, think about your own profession, teaching, and look at the role of automation and figure out 5% definitely done by algorithms of some sort. So this is a graph I found in one of these business magazines. This is UK, and it's trying to predict the percent of jobs that will go over to algorithms in the next, I think, 5 years or so. For the UK, the number is about 20%. For the United States, a much larger bubble, about 24 to 25, almost 30% of the jobs. And these are, white collar, blue collar, these are human beings being replaced by algorithms. Surprisingly, when it comes to the third world, here's India, it affects only 4 or 5%. Okay, so that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. That in the developing world, algorithms taking over jobs is likely to happen more slowly than it does in the West. But in our context, people who have to work with machines, and I think every child you see today, every college student you see today will have to work with machines. They need a new education. I mean, that I think is kind of given. And we spoke obviously about the future of learning, about the fact that the teacher and the student no longer need to be in the same space. We need our students to be able to transit into other abilities. If you take the average 8-year-old today, it's not hard to imagine that by the time they're about 40 or 50, they might be living on Mars. A fair proportion, a few percent. But what on earth will we teachers do to prepare them for that? We need to think about, our universities and schools need to think about what are those abilities? The reason for this video is to simply say, let them figure it out. If we can't make a formula, if we can't predict that future they're going to, the least we can do is to prepare them to figure it out by themselves. And every time I give them the opportunity, they're more than happy to do so. They love this idea of figuring it out by themselves. But remember those conditions, okay? The groups, the public visibility, the big questions, etc. We've already spoken about this. This is for audiences which didn't see the other one. I changed the picture just in case. Remember the degree? All of us have one of those. And just in time, this is from Boston. This is, I think, a picture of a dog meeting for the first time a dog that looks like a dog but is not a dog. It's an algorithm with 4 legs and no head. So Sir John Daniel, the first Vice Chancellor of Open University, his suggestion is the following, that students should be encouraged to ask questions. Not take things for granted, and move beyond information and knowledge to something called understanding. So what should universities do in the middle of this kind of a melee? Well, we're going to go into a discussion on this in the afternoon. But I think we need universities to focus on what they've always done the best at, is create the future. We can't predict it right now, but the best way to predict it right is to create it. If we look at our universities, we need to look at how much of that is the university actually doing. Is it only left to a few PhD students, a few professors inside some obscure room somewhere, or is the whole institution looking at creating a future? So I'm going to leave you with that. It's 5 to 12. We get into a discussion on this and the previous talk after lunch for a few minutes, and then I thought we should look at curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment in the inquiry mode. Because, as you notice, I haven't actually given answers, but I've told you what I've seen, and I've told you some of the questions that are confronting me, confronting all of us. We will try in the afternoon to see if we can get to some idea of the answers, or at least where the answers might lie. Okay. So, as you notice that if I've spent the whole morning talking about souls, in the afternoon there is no choice but to do them, right? So we'll see how that, in the process you'll get an idea of how souls actually work. But all that is after lunch. Joe?
Should we say be back about 1:45?
Okay.
45 minutes, is that?
Quarter
good for
to,
you?
yeah, it's
Yes.
fine for me. 1:45, ladies and gentlemen, back here.